The other consideration is that it's a strategy and tactics of direct action. Militant anti-fascists argue against turning to the state or the police or legislation or the courts to stop the far right.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations in the Northeast. The latest one being the station in Portland, Maine. You can see our show weekly at 7 p.m. So now our reach goes from mid-Maine to mid-New Jersey. To welcome Maine viewers, we have a bit of an interview I did with Bob Schaible of Maine Voices for Palestine, talking about his latest trip to the area in the fall during the olive harvest. I had asked him what was different during this trip from earlier visits. He responded in this audio interview, supplemented with photos he had taken.
And he began telling us about his confidence that one day things were going to work out, that the Jews and Palestinians could live amicably together. And he began telling us about a group that he and some other Palestinian youth had formed with some Israeli young Jews, and that they were working together to lessen tensions and actually to help the Jews were walking with Palestinians along a certain road that what was between Bethlehem and Hebron. In a certain section of that road, the Palestinians would be hassled and have rocks thrown at them by various settlers, and the Jewish young people started going along with them and were helping to curtail that harassment.
To see the whole interview, go to thestruggle.org, click on the button Struggle Video Media, and scroll down until you see the YouTube interview. By the way, the group Bob works with, their website is mvprights.org. Speaking of Palestine, we go to Gaza, where people get only a few hours of power a day.
For about 2 months, we've been getting electricity for maximum 4 hours a day. I had my first presentation in the university, and I was so stressed. While I was presenting, the electricity went off. When we want to study for exams, we many times study on the flashlight or on the candle lights. Our lives have become organized upon the electricity schedule.
Because they get so little power and at random hours, it is now routine for Palestinian women to wake up in the middle of the night to see if there's power to turn on washing machines or to start water pumps. These are photos of Ahed Tamimi in a play in her town of Nabi Saleh, organized by the Al Rawad Theater Group of Ida Camp. Yet instead of continuing these activities, Ahed Tamimi is in Israeli custody, she and her cousin and her mother, because of the crime of making an Israeli soldier look weak. Tamimi has been treated with the usual treatment non-Jewish minors get in Israeli custody: constant questioning without the presence of a lawyer or a parent. On the 28th of December, it was discovered that Ahed Tamimi's Twitter account had been suspended. Obviously, she didn't do it, being in prison, and it's unlikely her parents could have either, because the day Ahed was arrested, the Israelis confiscated all the electronics in the house. Is Twitter cooperating with the Israeli apartheid government's vendetta against the Tamimi family? Bassem Tamimi, father of Ahed, had a piece in the Israeli paper Haaretz. It began, "This night too, like all the nights since dozens of soldiers raided our home in the middle of the night, my wife Naarman and my 16-year-old daughter Ahed and Ahed's cousin Noor will spend behind bars. Although it is Ahed's first arrest, she is no stranger to your prisons. My daughter has spent her whole life under the heavy shadow of the Israeli prison." To see the whole article, go to The Struggle and click on the link. In early December, there were demonstrations all over about Trump's speech about Jerusalem, including one in Hebron, in H1, the all-Palestinian area of the large city. The nonviolent protests were met by violence by Israeli soldiers, and there were arrests. You will see now video from B'Tselem, an Israeli group, a video of 20 or so soldiers escorting a blindfolded Palestinian prisoner. At one point, a brave soldier punches the blindfolded prisoner. We'll superimpose the word "now" just before the crime. Now to Syria, where an infant lost his eye in an Assad or Russia bombardment. His mother was also killed in the attack. There's a campaign of solidarity with the little boy It's hashtag solidarity with Karim. People are covering up one eye, so for a moment they can see the world as he'll be seeing it for the rest of his life. Now to protests in Iran against the government. Reportedly, they've occurred in several cities, including the city of Mashhad, which is a big city in the northeast. Rabin Yassin Khattab writes, protesters in Qom, at the heart of the regime, are chanting, Khamenei, Khamenei, leave Iran. People in Isfahan are cheering as Khomeini billboards are burnt. Protests are being held in tens of cities. Many are chanting, leave Syria, think of us instead. The regime promised big benefits from the treaty with the U.S., and the people are seeing very little. Instead, it spends billions killing Syrians. Now, just a bit of a Democracy Now! Interview, which I found astounding. It's with retired Judge Shayara Scheindlin. She was the judge who ruled that the New York stop and frisk policy that was stopping 1 million people a year, mostly minorities, was wrong. It had to be changed. Mayor de Blasio, once he got into office, dropped the city's appeal of that ruling. Former Mayor Giuliani had predicted doom with skyrocketing crime increases. Here's what actually happened.
So hundreds of thousands of young black men, as you said, were stopped, and it's a big thing to be stopped and frisked. We don't realize it because we're not likely. I'm not likely, and probably neither of you are likely to be stopped or frisked. But it's a real intrusion, and it often goes bad. When you think of the young black men who've been shot, it's because a stop went bad. So it's a dangerous thing to be stopped, and you can often end up with an arrest. Anyway, the good news was the stops dropped by 97% as a result of my ruling. So it went down from 700,000 to less than 50,000 with no rise in crime. And that was satisfying, because had crime gone shooting up, as the then mayor and then police commissioner predicted, people would have said, it's your fault. This city has burnt up and it's your fault. But it didn't happen that way.
That is dramatic. A 97% decrease in stops and no increase in crime. As a matter of fact, New York is on its way to having its lowest number of murders since the 1950s. The rest of our program will be the first part of the talk by Mark Bray, the author of Antifa. He spoke at Wesleyan College, which happened to be his alma mater. He was introduced by Wesleyan professor Keolani Kawanui.
And now I will introduce Mark Bray. He is an historian of human rights, terrorism, and political radicalism in modern Europe, who is one of the organizers of Occupy Wall Street. He is the author of the book you'll hear about tonight, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, as well as a book titled Translating Anarchy, the Anarchism of Occupy Wall Street. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Critical Quarterly, Roar Magazine, and numerous edited volumes. As some of you know, he is currently a lecturer at Dartmouth College, where he's also taken a lot of hits, and I'd like to see sustained support for you in that. The way the Dartmouth president has been spewing is really upsetting. But also, he was Wesleyan class of 2005. So it's great to have you back for that as well. Although I can't say he was in American Studies or Anthropology, which I'm a professor in both. But on a personal note, Mark told me he was a philosophy major who worked with Steve Engel, and he wrote an honors thesis titled The Control Capability and a Fully Flourishing Society, which was a philosophical effort to derive anarchist conclusions from neo-Aristotelian philosophy. Please help me in welcoming Mark Bray.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Thank you, Kehlani, for organizing this. Thank you to all the sponsors. Yes, it's great to be back at Wesleyan. Wesleyan was really where I got my intellectual and political foundation back. I was class of '05, so back from 2001 onward, it really was an incredibly engaged, radical campus. I don't know how it is today, but you can tell me if you think that applies today. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the book that I wrote, talk about the history and politics of anti-fascism over the past century, and then at the end we can open it up for some questions and conversations. So the impetus of this book was the current state of affairs post-Trump. I went down to protest Trump on January 20th and 21st in Washington, D.C. with millions of other people. And this book really came out of reflecting on how we can push back against efforts to make racism great again, to make sexism great again. And so in that sense, this is a book that was written, researched, and put together in a relatively short period of time for a professional historian in the interest of having the insights of anti-fascist past and present available in this current circumstance and to explain what this is all about. So I call it a history, politics, and theory on the run. The book was based mainly off of interviews with 61 current and former anti-fascists from 17 different countries in Europe and North America. That's especially important because really, other than Great Britain, most of North American and European anti-fascism after World War II is not very well written about, not very well documented. And so, again, the purpose is to foreground the perspectives of people who have done this organizing so that people today who are trying to resist have a broader historical and geographical scope. Of course, the anti-fascist struggle is global. So in that sense, my focus on Europe and North America was simply an effort to confine the focus of the book to something manageable in a relatively short period of time. And also, I'm a European historian, so I had context there. Part of the reason why books like this haven't been written in the past is because a lot of anti-fascists are reluctant to speak to journalists and academics about what they do. They're concerned about being identified by law enforcement, identified by the far right. And so I often say that if I were them, I wouldn't have talked to me either. But fortunately, enough of them did, so I managed to get the interviews. The book focuses on one specific tendency within the anti-fascist tradition. In English and Italian, it's referred to as militant anti-fascism. In French, they call it radical anti-fascism. And in German, it's called autonomous anti-fascism. And it exists at the crossroads of two related considerations. The first is that it's a pan-radical left politics. It incorporates all sorts of socialists and anarchists and communists and other leftists who, at least for the time being, put aside everything that usually divides them in the interest of combating the common enemy. The other consideration is that it's a strategy and tactics of direct action. Militant anti-fascists argue against turning to the state or the police or legislation or the courts to stop the far right. And we'll get into why that is. So it's a pan-radical politics of direct action. It's an illiberal social revolutionary anti-capitalist politics as well. So it's not only about stopping the far right, it's also about projecting a certain vision of how social change ought to occur. The other clarification that I think is important to make is that it's important on the one hand to define this specific militant anti-fascist tradition because as we've seen in the press, there's a lot of confusion, right? And historians sometimes tend to talk about anti-fascism as if everyone who opposes fascism is an anti-fascist, which in a certain sense is true, but even during the 40s, there were actually fascists fighting against fascists, so, you take a step back from that. But definitions can also be limiting. So to go back to the start of the presentation in terms of talking about this as colonized land, I think that we can think of what Ami Césaire said about Nazism as European imperialism, colonialism, and genocide brought home to the European continent. And so if we take that as a starting point and think of fascism as one specific variant of a broader global tendency towards death and destruction, then I think you can think of anti-fascism explicitly described as such as one small little sliver of resistance to white supremacy and domination that goes back to 1492, goes back to the first slave ships, and goes beyond. So in that way, I think my focus of my book is on those who have identified with the term anti-fascism, but if we have a much more global scope of it, it can be viewed much more widely. So that's important to clarify as well. So let's go through the history a little bit. Certainly in an official sense, you can start with fascism with Mussolini after World War I. Other scholars, though, have pointed to perhaps the KKK as being the first proto-fascist group. In that sense, Klan resistance could be considered a kind of anti-fascism, of course. Others have pointed to the anti-Semitic leagues that formed during the Dreyfus Affair in France, the Action Française and others, as proto-fascist formations. And even in that context, there was the Coalition Révolutionnaire formed by anarchists and extra-parliamentary socialists who confronted these anti-Semites in the streets and shut down their meetings and defended Dreyfusards, the defenders of the wrongfully accused Jewish Captain Dreyfus as they attended court. So you can trace it farther back, but if you start with Italy, you can look to the Arditi del Popolo as the first kind of anti-fascist militia that formed in Italy to fight back against Mussolini's black shirts pictured there. So important for understanding this context, of course, is that this came on the heels of the Biennio Rosso, or 2 red years, right after World War I, when the Italian left was on the verge of social revolution. They were occupying land, they were taking over factories, and the Italian left was looking towards revolution. At first, they weren't really paying attention to these guys. So when Mussolini started out, he had 100 men in 1919, but 2 years later, that was up to 250,000, and he had the backing of Italian elites in crushing left organizing. The Arditi del Popolo was a federal pan-radical left militia. It had about 144 sections, 20,000 militants taking up rifles, going to towns and villages to fight back against Mussolini's black shirts. It ultimately failed for a number of reasons. One is it started well after a lot of left infrastructure had already been crushed. But perhaps most importantly was the fact that after a little while the Italian Socialist Party pulled out. They pursued a pact of pacification with Mussolini to try and deal with things in an electoral legalistic manner. And the new Communist Party pulled out as well. So at the end, the only institutional support the Arditi had came from the anarchist movement, though rank and file members of all parties continued to fight. Another asterisk for the presentation is I focus on anti-fascism when fascist regimes are not yet in power, so I'm going to move on to Italy. I'm in Germany right now. Talk about Germany a little bit. So here you have the images of the Red Front Fighters League, which was a militia created by the Communist Party in the mid-1920s in the tradition of the Proletarian Hundreds and other formations that came before. They were really mostly formed as a revolutionary group, not as an anti-fascist formation initially per se. Here we have the origin of the anti-fascist fist. So certainly the fist had been used in labor imagery previously, but as the kind of symbol that it would come to be known as, this is the origin of the anti-fascist fist, which originally was a communist symbol. Interestingly enough, this fist inspired Hitler to adopt Mussolini's fascist salute in 1926 after they adopted it several years earlier. So in Germany, the fist came before the fascist salute. You see it in the bottom right there as well. Here we have the origin of another popular anti-fascist symbol, the 3 arrows. Who's seen this symbol before? Does this look familiar? Okay. All right. I'm happy that this crowd represents. I've done some other presentations where the hands haven't gone up, so I'm happy some hands went up. All right, so here we have the origins of the anti-fascist 3 arrows. So this starts with the Iron Front, which was an electoral coalition created by the Socialist Party in the early 30s. So it originated when a Russian emigre named Chakotin was walking around Berlin trying to think of a new symbol to represent this Iron Front coalition to kind of rebrand the Socialist Party as their electoral fortunes were sagging. So he comes across an image of a swastika where someone drew a line through it. And he imagines this single line as a downward-facing arrow, and then imagines that single arrow as 3 arrows. And hence you have the 3 arrows. So here you see socialists holding 3 arrows, and the flag's in the top right. The Iron Front against fascism really, though, was an attempt for the Socialist Party to try to balance 2 sort of contradictory considerations. On the one hand, they wanted to present a more militant opposition to Hitler and the fascists, and they wanted to sort of rebrand themselves as they were losing at the polls. The Communist Party was ascendant, the Nazis were ascendant. On the other hand, they still wanted to support the Weimar government because they were essentially accepting austerity measures from this government. So they wanted to seem militant while also sort of holding on to a support for the government, kind of a paradoxical situation, and the Iron Front was what they created. It's been credited as kind of an anti-fascist militia, though the Reichsbanner socialist militia was part of it. It was really an electoral formation. And when Hitler took over, it had very little to offer in the way of militant resistance. The Iron Front inspired the communists to create Anti-Fascist Action, which is sort of the name that a lot of post-war anti-fascist groups have taken. Though in France in the 1920s, there was a Comité d'Action Antifasciste that had that kind of name earlier. So here we have a Communist Party headquarters in the early 1930s getting ready for an election. And the Anti-Fascist Action was essentially the Communist Party's version of the Iron Front. It was primarily an electoral coalition because neither party was really countenancing an aggressive anti-fascist militant strategy. They were focusing on elections and labor organizing primarily. So the original image is two flags. They were originally both red. This is a black and white photo, of course, but they're both red. One for socialism and one for communism. The idea was to create the image of anti-fascist unity to win over socialist voters to vote for the communist ticket. But it wasn't actually a sincere gesture of kind of pan-radical left unity because at the very same time, it was still the middle of what the Communist International referred to as the third period, which in short was Moscow said that socialists were, quote, social fascists, just as bad as fascists, and therefore, up until the very end, the communists focused on the socialists as being greater enemies than the Nazis. We can talk about why that was later and what ramifications it had. But when Hitler took power in 1933, the slogan of the German Communist Party was "First Hitler, then us," by which they meant they thought Hitler would get into power, he would do such a terrible job governing that 6 months or 9 months later, he'd be out and the communists could ride in on his coattails to a successful government. Of course, that isn't what happened, but it shows you that it wasn't until much later that some European left leaders took the threat of fascism seriously.
More next week. Well, thanks for watching. See you next week. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.